The Marines who landed on the shore of Guadalcanal in 1942 were gripping rifles their fathers had used back in the trenches of the First World War. While newspapers praised American industry, thousands of frontline fighters faced a brutal reality. In one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, they were armed with relics. This was not the triumph of a well-oiled military assembly line. It was logistical chaos, where every shot could become the last because of the design limitations of old metal. The main scandal of this campaign was hidden not in the command's strategy, but in the monstrous price soldiers had to pay for the gap between the ambitions of headquarters and the capabilities of the rear. The final lesson is why this transitional war became a personal catastrophe for a generation. August 7, 1942. Marines land on the shore, expecting an easy walk, but find only heated steel and silence. Operation Watchtower looked flawless on maps, but Guadalcanal was harsher. The first major U.S. offensive in the Pacific became a frantic attempt to hold an island where the jungle swallowed people. America entered the war without a polished supply system for a tropical conflict. Chaos began during the landing. Supplies were dumped in piles, crates with medicine and ammunition were mixed up. Marines from training camps entered a zone ruled only by survival. The gap between headquarters reports and the everyday life of ordinary soldiers became obvious immediately. While Washington was dividing up the maps of future victories, every third fighter pushing through the thickets was holding a greeting from 1903 in his hands. The rifle that had been used back in the trenches of the First World War became the main argument against the Japanese army. The M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action classic, ended up at the front not because of soldiers' preferences, but because the military industry could not keep up with the appetite of the front line. The rifle's design was reliable, quality steel, and a predictable trigger. In 1942, it remained a formidable tool. Yet America had already launched production of the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic weapon that could flood the enemy with lead. Because of logistical failures, the Garands did not reach everyone. A strange contrast formed. Elite units received the new weapons, while Marines on the islands wore out warehouse leftovers. For a Marine, this meant entering the jungle with a weapon technically inferior to the firepower of comrades in other units. However, the age of the metal was only the top of the problem. But as it turned out, in dense forest conditions, the matter was not only the age of the metal. The M1903 was not simply old, it had a level of accuracy that Marines held onto until the very end. In 1942, while automatic systems were still imperfect, the Springfield remained a benchmark of precision. In dense forest, where the enemy appears for a fraction of a second, this factor decided everything. Marines used Springfields for precise hunting of Japanese snipers hidden in tree crowns. Fighters trained before the war followed the principle: one shot, one target. There could be no mistake. Every miss cost seconds spent on reloading. However, the jungle is not a shooting range and does not forgive manual bolt cycling. While a Marine worked the bolt, a Japanese soldier managed to fire 3 bullets. This was the arithmetic of death on Guadalcanal. American bolt-action rifles collided with Japanese Arisaka Type 99 rifles. The Japanese weapon was shorter, lighter, and more effective in close combat. The enemy's tactics were built on dense fire from ambushes, turning any contact into a speed contest. When Japanese infantry moved onto Marine positions, the rate of fire from the M1903 proved critically low. For an American, every movement of the bolt stretched into eternity while the enemy pressed him with fire. The Japanese command drew its own conclusion. American use of First World War-era rifles looked like proof that America was not ready for war on their terrain. American factories stamped out millions of weapons, but Guadalcanal received rifles on a leftover basis. Logistics turned into chaos. Crates of food and ammunition were dumped on the shore without any system, and part of the cargo sank in the coastal strip before the fighting even began. A rigid hierarchy of scarcity formed. Elite units took the few available M1 Garands. The rest received Springfields from long-term storage depots. Spare parts were almost absent. A breakdown meant searching for a captured weapon, relying on a knife and shovel, or facing death. At 90% humidity, even a reliable mechanism could rust within a day. The wooden stocks of the Springfield swelled, jamming the bolts while the metal required constant cleaning, for which there was no time under fire. In the jungle, weapons aged not by years but by hours. In the morning the rifle still seemed serviceable, by evening the bolt handle was already moving stiffly, and at night a soldier might hear, instead of a shot, a dry metallic failure. Guadalcanal was nothing like a training range where a rifle could be cleaned calmly. Here the ground breathed steam, clothing stayed wet for weeks, straps molded, and cartridges had to be protected from moisture. A soldier slept in a wet hole, ate in a wet uniform, and kept beside him a rifle that absorbed the dampness along with him. Salt, sand, and tropical downpours ate away at the rifle's finish. Small particles clogged the receiver, settled in grooves, got under the extractor, and turned every movement of the bolt into a struggle against the environment itself. While attempts were made to adapt the M1 Garand to the jungle, old Springfields proved especially vulnerable. Their reliability, earned through hardship on other fronts and in another war, no longer seemed absolute. The mechanism that had worked in Europe in 1918 became a burden on Guadalcanal. It demanded attention, cleanliness, and time, and the island gave none of these. After a night rain, the rifle had to be inspected as if it had already been wounded. Any spot of rust could become the beginning of a failure. Any swollen section of wood could become the reason the metal stopped moving freely. Marines kept rags in their hands for days, trying to save bolts from corrosion, but the jungle won. They cleaned their weapons in pauses between attacks, under tarps, in darkness, on their knees in mud, sometimes almost by touch, oil mixed with sand, sweat, and rainwater. The rifle became not just a weapon, but a constant concern, demanding attention even when the man himself could barely stay on his feet. The most terrifying thing was that failure might appear not during inspection, but during a Japanese attack. As the enemy approached through thickets and tracers flew overhead, the Marine had to believe his old bolt-action rifle would work. But belief did not cancel physics. Humidity ate away at the metal, wood changed shape, and dirt penetrated where the blueprints assumed dry cleanliness. They had no choice except to fight with this iron. Photographs of parades in the States and reports from the island belonged to two worlds. Propaganda broadcast the image of a flawlessly equipped soldier, but the reality of Guadalcanal was far from the pictures. In photographs back home, a Marine looked like part of a mighty military machine. Helmet, straps, clean uniform, confident gaze, and a rifle that had become a symbol of American discipline. On the island, that image fell apart in mud, sweat, and night fear. Command concealed the shortage of modern weapons so as not to weaken public support. America needed to believe that its army was already ready for a major clash with Japan. That industry was coping, that every soldier received the best. But between newspaper confidence and the front lay an ocean, and ships had to choose what came first: ammunition, food, medicine, artillery, radios, or new rifles. A dangerous imbalance formed. Some units received semi-automatic rifles, while others held positions with old bolt actions. In one trench, a Marine could hear the neighboring sector answering the Japanese with dense Garand fire, while he himself remained with a weapon that required a manual movement after every shot. The difference was not theoretical, it was felt in the tempo of battle, in the pauses between shots, in how quickly the enemy closed the distance. This created gaps in fire density. During a Japanese attack, units armed with Springfields could not suppress the enemy. When a charge began from the darkness, every second of reloading became a breach. The soldier fired, pulled his face away from the sightline, worked the bolt, looked for the target again, pulled the trigger again. Against soldiers rushing through thickets and ravines, this was often too little. When ammunition ran low, the heavy rifle remained the last shield separating the soldier from death. It was accurate, powerful, and familiar, but it did not provide the volume of fire the island demanded. In the jungle, the enemy rarely appeared as a neat target. He emerged suddenly, close, sometimes within grenade-throwing range. Where an avalanche of bullets was needed, the Springfield answered with single blows. The propaganda image of American superiority could not survive this reality. The weapons legend that had been a source of pride for decades suddenly showed its age, not because it was bad, but because the war had changed faster than the depots had managed to renew themselves. The Marines on Guadalcanal became hostages of transition. The army knew the future, but the front paid for the past. That is why veterans' stories sounded not like parade chronicles, but bitter confessions. They remembered not the shine of steel, but that very pause after the shot, when the hand reached for the bolt and someone in the darkness was already running toward them. This pause became the symbol of the gap between what America promised its soldiers and what it was able to give them in the first months of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal dispelled the illusion that industrial power guaranteed immediate advantage. In 1942, the U.S. military machine was stalling. Factories were working at full capacity, but the factory front chain was broken. On paper, the country had colossal resources. On the island, what mattered was the rifle in a soldier's hands that night. Industry did not automatically become salvation. Between the factory floor and the jungle stood thousands of kilometers, overloaded ports, a shortage of ships, Japanese aviation, submarine threats, unloading chaos, and a constant shortage of priority cargo. Even if a new weapon existed, it did not instantly reach the right trench. War required not only manufacturing, but also delivering, distributing, repairing, training, and supplying. In a wet trench, the winner was not the one who had a giant assembly line behind him, but the one whose bolt had not jammed from humidity. This truth broke the comfortable belief in industrial America's invincibility. A soldier could not take cover behind production statistics. He could not fire a report on M1 Garand output. He could rely only on the weapon already at his position. Commanders changed tactics. They protected fighters with M1 Garands and used them to cover those still tied to the Springfield. Semi-automatic rifles became peculiar nodes of defense, around which the fire pattern was built. Where night attacks were expected, men with Garands were placed to compensate for slower neighbors. But this adaptation was forced and painful. It meant that not all soldiers on the line had equal chances. One could release a series of shots while barely changing his body position. Another was forced each time to break rhythm, move his hand, open the bolt, eject the casing, chamber a new cartridge. In close combat, this became a question of survival. The Springfield remained an accurate rifle, but accuracy did not always decide the outcome of a night clash. In the thickets, where a target is visible only for an instant, the ability to hold the enemy under continuous fire proved more important. The old manual bolt dictated a tempo that did not match the tempo of the jungle. The island demanded speed, and the Springfield answered with the discipline of the previous century. The price was measured in lives given for every meter of jungle, every supply delay, every batch of outdated weapons, every incomplete set of modern arms turned into additional losses. At headquarters, this looked temporary. At the front, it looked like a man who made one accurate shot, but not a second. Thus, Guadalcanal tested not only the Marine Corps, but the American military system. It showed that the strength of a state is tested not at the moment plans are announced, but at the moment when a dirty, hungry, exhausted soldier raises his rifle at night and waits to see whether it will work. The Springfield left the front not because it was weak, but because war had become too dynamic for a manual bolt. This rifle had been created for an era where range, accuracy, fire discipline, and the skill of the shooter were valued. But the Pacific Ocean of 1942 demanded something else: short reaction times, dense fire, fast follow-up shots, and the ability to hold a position when the enemy was already almost in the trench. By late 1942, as supply improved, the share of M1 Garands on Guadalcanal grew. The change was not immediate, but it was felt. Where yesterday the defensive line sounded with rare single cracks of bolt-action rifles, a more frequent, confident rhythm gradually appeared. Soldiers gained the ability to answer faster without breaking away from the target after each shot. Springfields were gradually pushed into sniper and auxiliary roles. In that role, they remained dangerous and useful. Its long barrel, powerful cartridge, and accuracy let an experienced shooter work where automatic tempo mattered less. But for an ordinary Marine sitting in a wet hole and waiting for a night attack, this was weak consolation. The lesson for the Pentagon was harsh. Millions of rifles in depots were useless if soldiers lacked automatic fire. The number of reserves itself ceased to be a guarantee of combat capability. The war showed that a weapon must be evaluated not only by quantity, reliability, and cost, but also by how well it fits the specific battlefield. The Springfield was an excellent answer to the questions of the old war, but Guadalcanal was asking new questions. The Springfield became a tool for experienced shooters who could exploit its accuracy. It required calm, skill, endurance, and an understanding of distance. In the hands of a sniper or a well-trained fighter, it could remain deadly effective. But mass infantry no longer needed a symbol of the rifle school, but a weapon capable of compensating for fatigue, darkness, fear, and the chaos of sudden contact. For the rank and file, this meant the end of the one-shot era. The soldier of the future war could no longer rely only on personal marksmanship. He had to be part of a fire system, where density, tempo, and mutual cover decided more than a perfect shot at a distant target. The Garand did not replace skill, but let a fighter correct a miss faster than the enemy could exploit it. But the transition cost losses that could not be dismissed as ordinary logistics. It is too easy after victory to say that the shortage of modern weapons was a temporary difficulty. For those who lived through the first months on the island, that temporariness was measured in friends left in the mud and in nights when the old bolt had to be worked faster than muscles allowed. The Springfield departed not as a broken rifle, but as a veteran facing demands too harsh. It was not thrown out of history, but pushed to where its strength still made sense. On Guadalcanal, however, it became clear, even a legendary weapon can arrive too late if the battlefield has changed faster than the army managed to replace the legacy of the past. Every time a Marine worked the bolt, he risked failing to fire a second shot. In Guadalcanal close combat, this was a sentence. The manual movement that looked familiar and almost mechanical on a shooting range became, during a night attack, a pause between life and death. In that pause, the enemy could rise, rush forward, throw a grenade, or disappear into the thickets, only to appear even closer. Casualties in units with outdated Springfields were noticeably higher than among those with Garands. This gap became a symbol of the inconvenient truth about the American Army of 1942. The country, which was already beginning to turn into the industrial giant of the war, was still paying on the front line for the uneven transition to modern arms. Not all units entered the new era at the same time. The rifle became a monument to a reality where headquarters plans shattered against the wet sand of the islands. Maps could show defense lines, reports could list supplies, newspapers could promise victory. But at night, when the jungle came alive with sounds, everything came down to whether a specific man could open the bolt, chamber a cartridge, and catch the target again in time. Grand strategy shrank to a few movements of the hand. Veterans remembered the Springfield not as a legend, but as a too-slow partner with whom they had gone through hell. They did not deny its power and accuracy, but the memory of Guadalcanal was stronger than respect for the design. For them, this rifle smelled not of gun oil in an arsenal, but of rotting leaves, wet uniforms, hot metal after firing, and fear that next time the bolt would not move so easily. The most frightening question remained: why was this weapon not enough at the decisive moment? Why did an army with enormous capabilities allow its soldiers to meet a new war with a weapon of old logic? The answer did not fit into a single cause. There was the speed of entry into the war, the unreadiness of supply, production delays, delivery difficulties, and the belief that a proven rifle would still hold up. The story of Guadalcanal is a chronicle of survival on the edge. America came to this island not as an all-powerful colossus, but as an army learning to fight on the move while holding relics of the past. This army won not because everything had been perfectly prepared, but because soldiers adapted faster than the system could correct its own mistakes. They covered with their bodies the gaps between doctrine and reality. When the last Marine left the island, he left behind comrades and the belief that rear factories could instantly protect a soldier from front chaos. After Guadalcanal, it became impossible to look at warehouse figures as a guarantee of victory. It mattered not only to have weapons, but to give them in time to the man standing in the first line. It was a victory bought with the 10 seconds missing for reloading an old rifle during a night attack. In those seconds fit the entire tragedy of a transitional army, between past and future, between manual bolt and semi-automatic fire, between pride in the legendary Springfield and the bitter understanding that a legend does not always save a man in the dark. The M1903 Springfield remained not as a failure, but as a reminder of delayed modernization. It was a good weapon that entered a moment when good was no longer enough. Guadalcanal did not destroy its reputation, but forever changed the meaning of that reputation. Behind accuracy and reliability now stood the shadow of an island where too many learned that sometimes one shot is less than what is needed to survive.